So first of all, thank you to Mark and the team for putting this on. In terms of well-being, we're always talking about it, but it's great to have this opportunity to do something about it. And I hope this hour and a bit of our time that we've set aside and you've made a priority today by committing to this is something that will be practically of help. All I can do in the time before us today is just touch, and I want to touch on these three areas that Mark's referenced a couple of them. And firstly, just some of the feedback from the January clergy survey on wellbeing that we did. We did do a feedback to all the clergy on it at the time, but January is a world away at the moment, considering everything else that's happened. So just want to pick up on some of what the review group thought was some of the notable areas for that. Then a brief introduction and touch on some of the clergy covenant. Some of you will be aware of the covenant for clergy care and wellbeing. For others, it's perhaps very new. So just a little bit about that to give you some context and hopefully encouragement to engage with it. And a slightly shorter note then on the living ministry project Thrive. And I think all clergy, again, I think have been sent out the book that they produced, booklet, but again, just to draw attention to some of the aspects of that. And I hope these three tie in together. I guess my health warning at the beginning of this is, I think we can turn up to a session, let me make it more personal. I think if I'd signed up to this, I'd hope to come away with it having sort of learned something that I want to get out of it in terms of well-being. Part of, I guess, what I think I'll probably be doing is asking questions rather than giving you answers, pointing to areas that I hope will help our attention. And through giving attention to the areas that chime with us, that might be the place that actually we might find some of the well, possibly answers, but perhaps areas that are going to help us in terms of well-being. I hope that makes some sense. So, picking up then from the survey we did back in January, apologies for the size if you can't necessarily read all of that. Hopefully some of it will come through depending on what kind of device you're on. I'll try to make this clear. If things aren't clear as we go through, do please interrupt, because I don't want to waste time talking here. I'm just missing where it needs to land. The first one I want to pick up on was this question number 18, which was to do to the extent in which people feel they're flourishing in ministry. Can you may have life in all its fullness. In one sense, we might be encouraged to say that nearly 2/3, 64% of clergy in the diocese that responded felt that they are flourishing in ministry, and only 17 feel that they're not. That could be seen as a positive response. Personally, to hear that 17% of our clergy feel that they're not flourishing, I would see as a concerning number. That's over 1/6 of our clergy feel that they're not flourishing. So what is it that we're doing, or what's not working in the way that we're setting things up for people or not supporting them? And that, as I say, 17% of those responding feel that they're not flourishing. Well, one of the areas that we also picked up on a bit more was to do with what prevents people from taking advantage of those things that might help them flourish, the things that give us life. We gave various options to this, but the interesting bit was here that half of those who responded, and this is the 64 who responded to this question, half of them came up really saying it's their workload and the concomitant commitments that prevent them from taking advantage of the things that give them life. The sadness of this is that, in a sense, as clergy, we are the people who are most free from most other people I know in roles and jobs to have control over our time. It doesn't always feel like that, but in practice, that's the reality. Common tenure, interestingly, doesn't tell you how many hours you should work a day. There's nothing in there which says this is your set hours. It talks about how many days off you should have, which, by the way, which if you can't remember, that's 36 plus bank holidays, just a reminder out there for you. But it doesn't tell you about the hours. It talks about working 6 days a week, but it doesn't tell you, again, the hours. And yet half of the people responding said the problem was to do with time. So what is it there that we need to help with, or we need to address in terms of the balance of the workload and the expectations, which I think is part of that, that end up with half of our clergy responding saying this is the real thing that gets in the way of the flourishing that they would look for in their ministry. Allied to this was this question, in some sense quite healthy responses. Question 20, which of the following have you done in the past year to help improve or maintain your well-being? Lots of good things about exercise, healthy diets, holidays, times with family, all the things we'd want to say. But the one that sort of stuck out to the review group, and the review group, by the way, was a combination of Bishop Debbie, myself, and Susan Beckett in terms of her HR side. But also we had a church warden, a clergy person, and a clergy person's spouse, each with areas of expertise or experience in well-being or mental health. And the one that stuck out to us was number 3 on that, making time for a hobby. So what is it about clergy that feels perhaps guilty about committing to a regular time, perhaps to commit to a hobby, especially a hobby, I guess people find it difficult, and certainly the clergy I've worked with, where they've done something like singing or sport that's been part of a regular time, where they've had to sort of block out a Wednesday evening or whatever it might be, a Thursday lunchtime, to meet with that group who are also involved in making that hobby possible. What is it that means that so few of us commit to finding that time? A time which we believe, and certainly as a group, would be one of those life-giving things that actually fill our well in terms of what we have then to give back to others. Some of us can multitask. Rachel will be doing a hobby while recording this program and listening to it at the same time. But for many others of us, how do we, what is it that prevents us from cutting that out? Perhaps for those who are married, it's if we think we have any spare time, as we might use it in that rather bad use of the language, it has to be family time. But surely good hobbies are life-giving to us, to family, to work, and everything else. So a question to live with there, I think, and address around hobbies. We also came up with this slightly disturbing graph. This is to do with taking time off. And the slightly surprising thing to us, and if you can't see the writing at the bottom, the green is those who usually find that they can take sufficient time off in terms of both annually and in terms of days off. The yellow block is those who sometimes manage it. The next color, which I don't know what that is, salmon or whatever, is rarely, and the red block is those who never find that they can take off the time that they are permitted to take off. And you'll notice it's that penultimate block, the 60 to 69-year-olds, who seem to struggle most in terms of taking the time off that they're allowed or that they're told to in terms of common tenure.
Richard, I'm slightly nervous because this is the figures from January. I'm slightly scared what they would look like if you did that same thing.
Absolutely, Rachel. And we haven't wanted to run this again because there's been enough on people's plate at the moment, but revisiting it will be really interesting. You're absolutely right, Rachel. But with that penultimate block there, what is it about that age group, perhaps? Those we might think, coming to their last chapter where they should be wisest, perhaps most experienced in sorting out well-being, time off, and everything else. Is it because they come from, this is speculation totally, but is it because they come from an era where there were different expectations in terms of, time commitments, and you did your job and every phone call you had to answer no matter what? Is it because they might not have been instilled with a rule of life or something, the way that perhaps the newer cohort coming through we've tried to push in? Those are speculations, but wherever you are on that spectrum, it's concerning. It's better to see what's happening at the lower end, but what we don't want to see is this as a progression, that as people go through, of course, that if you like, the habits become worse. And then finally, in terms of reporting back from the survey, we've combined here two questions, question 14 and question 6. Question 6 gave us how long people had been in their current post. Question 14, as you'll see, compared how you felt 3 years ago. Do you perceive how is your well-being now? Has remained the same? The top one, improved, the middle, or deteriorated? The worryingly long bottom one, the numbers there, 30, saying it's deteriorated over 3 years. But when we combine this with how long people had been in their current post, and Mark referenced this, I think, in the introduction invitation to this time today. What it seems to suggest is those that 5 to 7 years in post was the time that most people found was most tricky. A lot of people saying this is the time that well-being had deteriorated, and a lot of people then finding this is the time that they then moved. Whereas other research has indicated that actually it's not until around about the 7-year mark most people's ministry has the most impact, that it becomes settled in, that it's that time that the structures that they've had to work hard to establish begin to bear fruit and show life and growth within a benefice, within a parish. The very time we're finding a lot of people are thinking, actually, it's getting tough now, we've been through these years, things have deteriorated, I need to move. So perhaps as clergy, there's something we need to recognize in both those bits of reporting, that is it the time that we have to hold on through those tougher years a little bit when we've done the hard yards, to say, actually, if we stayed on a few more, might we, if you like, reap a little bit of the hard work that we've sown and see better results? I think people seem to be, from the evidence around in the 30 odd years I've been ordained, people do seem to be moving more around those 5 to 7 years than they used to, thinking perhaps I need to move on because I need to get the next job or whatever. Speculation a bit, but the moving is certainly happening. So those are things, there might be other bits of people who remember the survey might want to pick up on, but those are the areas I just wanted to highlight for that and the questions to raise. So moving on next to, sorry, some of this is lost behind the pictures, depending on the display you're using. But I want to just mention a little bit about the clergy covenant. So back in February this year, General Synod made the covenant for the care and well-being of clergy an active synod. And the head of the working group, Sam Bucker, said this: our vision is that the work of supporting clergy in their ministry will become an integral part of the life of the church and part of the DNA of every aspect of our mission and ministry. That is a lofty ideal. So what do we need to do to make that happen? The covenant itself suggests various areas of attention. Pastoral supervision comes as a major theme throughout it. It's something that we're doing far more of in our IME 1 to 7. Various good practices that we're putting in there in terms of the kind of action learning sets and other groups that we're putting in there. The rule of life that I've talked about. Foundational habits that we pray people ordained ministers will keep and build on through their ministry. But for others, we realize as a diocese, and as this covenant is encouraging us, find the appropriate kind of pastoral supervision, which may mean different things to different people. What we believe is right is that pastoral supervision needs to meet the need, not just be a particular provision that we think will work for others. But that focus is something we need to attend to. The covenant also talks about what needs to go in, not just to the licensing services of clergy, but also there in the parish profiles coming out. What is it that parishes and benefices need to commit to in their care for clergy well-being and where appropriate for their families as well? And it recommends that we strengthen both the profiles and that liturgical commitment that is there at the time of licensing. Debbie in a moment will say more about MDRs, a vital tool that's also an important part of the provision that we can provide. And the question is, what other ways might we share best practice? The other aspect of the covenant I want to talk about a little bit, and it's there as part of the big conversation they're encouraging that happens at various levels, parishes, at deaneries, and in the wider diocese, is 3 documents they've released. And if you go to the Church of England website, in terms of the Clergy Covenant, you'll see each of these downloadable. And we're going to be pushing these out, encouraging them through deaneries, through parishes, for them to have a look at 3 documents. But it encourages us, at 3 levels. The first level is clergy self-care. We recognise, I hope, and would think it right, that there is a self-responsibility for us in terms of our own well-being. So questions in this document for what else we might do to make sure we make the right kind of choices in terms of our own well-being. The second document looks a little bit wider at the local level. I've talked about that commitment liturgically and in the parish profile when people begin. But in terms of the ongoing care at the local level, the parish benefice level, what needs to change? What needs to develop so we're better at that stage? Some clergy have fantastic church wardens and PCCs and others who look after them and really support them well. Others don't. What do we need to do to make sure there's better provision for all? And the third level is at the level of our bishops and wider church provision, the national institutions and so on. What do we need to do differently there? And I've just earlier this morning trying to begin a draft that Susan and I are trying to produce for our senior staff in this document so that we get better at what we're doing in that sense of provision as well. So those are just some things of introducing us, and we put this through Diocesan Synod a couple of weeks ago to introduce all this. It'll come back to Diocesan Synod in the spring or summer so that we can adopt, hopefully, that covenant as a diocese. But also in the meantime, as I say, we want to push that conversation at local level as well. But the third level I wanted to mention briefly is this work done by the Living Ministry Project for how clergy thrive. So this is both statistical data and surveys and in-depth interviews with a focus group that took 4 cohorts of clergy, those ordained in 2006, 2011, 2015, and those who have started training in 2016. So they're midway through this project, they're 5 years in, but there are already some things that are coming out from this that it's worth noticing. First of all, about the whole nature of well-being. The first thing they say is that well-being is varied. That is partly that it's subjective. There's no one right sense or definition of what well-being is. There are some things we can talk about, as we have been today, which are held in common, but there'll be personal aspects, which mean both the experience of it and how we engage with it is very different. It's a vital factor, is all those personal things. And those personal aspects may and probably very much will change over time. So again, you can't just tie down well-being and saying, this is well-being, this is how you need to address it, and this is how people will experience it. You need to, as I say, it's varied. So the second thing about that is, therefore, well-being constantly has to be negotiated. For all of us, our lives are bound up with those around us, both those in terms of friends and family, but the context in which we're in, negotiations with our congregations, with our bishop, with our wider institutions of society. So recognizing that is an important second aspect. The third thing it says through this report is well-being is holistic. It's far more than just saying, for example, well-being is about your mental health. Yes, it is, but it's bigger than that as well. One of the things we keep recognizing, for example, is well-being is about housing in this diocese. You know, if you've got housing that's constantly causing you a problem, it's constantly going to affect your well-being. It might be about your finances. It might be about a whole range of other attitudes, aspects. Well-being is holistic. We need to recognize there's not going to be just one thing we address that's suddenly going to necessarily sort or help with well-being. And then fourthly, as just described from the clergy covenant, as that recognizes so strongly, well-being is a shared responsibility. I think the one thing just to note about that is, whereas I've said, you know, it's a wider church, and perhaps it's also in our wider family and friends as well, part of that, wider context that we're a part of, and our own well-being, that actually, as it says, by the fact that well-being is our own responsibility as well, is that well-being can actually feel like yet another burden that we have to attend to, slightly ironically. You know, that dealing with our own well-being, you know, can be a burden on our well-being, but that's just the reality that we need to notice. And then just finally, perhaps, the report has identified under Thrive 6 areas that just very quickly I'll mention that it says that are important to attend to. The first is to tune into healthy rhythms. Again, we're back to rule of life, but noticing for ourselves in diet, in exercise, in hobbies, and all those other things, what are the healthy habits that we need to attend to? And Christians should be better at doing this than others through those ideas of rule of life. Secondly, how do we handle expectations? Being aware that there'll be a whole variety of expectations, some of those thrust upon us. How do we handle this? How do we choose those? Which links into the third about recognizing times of vulnerability, giving us permission at times. Yes, looking for the right permission for others, but recognizing the times that we might find things particularly difficult. Just one small example, I remember somebody who said to me that they learned in their curacy that when they were taking a funeral, they used to take off exactly the same amount of time that the funeral had taken them. They'd go off to a cafe or something afterwards, because they knew that personally they needed that amount of time at least, just to begin to process the emotional energy that funeral had taken from, the emotional depth that it demanded of them. So recognize those times. How do we deal with those? Identifying safe spaces to be heard. What are those spaces we need to boundary for ourselves and to identify to make sure that we have those spaces where someone else is listening to us? It's not a question of being brave, it's a question of being wise. So what do we need to put in place? Value and affirm, what do we need to be valued and affirmed? We see our ministry very often as valuing and affirming others, and thank God, and that's right. But we also, of course, need to be valued and affirmed as children of God. Where are we getting that? Who do we need to remind that perhaps at times that's part of their role to do it for us as well? And then finally, establishing healthy boundaries. Pray God, others will help us do that. But again, a lot of that's going to be partly what we need to make sure that we establish as well. Because if we can establish the boundaries, we can often make those spaces in which our health can be protected. So that's all I want to say. I'm noting that there's a lot of work in this area being done by St. Luke's and Sheldon. St. Luke's, for those who don't know, morphed from being a sort of physical hospital really into emphasizing clergy well-being and doing a lot of great work in that area. And Sheldon, Mary and Martha, many of you will have come across and used. Again, not just a place, but thank God still a place, but also engaging this whole area of well-being. Mark, I think that's enough for me.
Thank you, Richard. Let's pass straight on to Bishop Debbie, and then we'll have some time to be able to talk in groups and understand what your particular concerns are. Bishop Debbie, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to follow up on some of the things that Richard has been saying, but to put it into the context of MDRs. So just the overview of MDRs, I've now been involved in being on the other side of the table for about 18 months and having experienced it in a different diocese, learning what it looks like here and the way it's run. So getting used to that. It's been one of the most privileged things I've been involved in, I have to say, since I took up this role. Being able to spend a really good amount of time with clergy is a massive privilege. And some of them, just the level of honesty and vulnerability that people are willing to share is really quite incredible. But I think that's the first thing that I want to say is your experience of an MDR will depend on so many different things. And it will depend on levels of trust and feeling able to be honest and vulnerable, amount of time spent preparing for it, the amount of self-awareness and self, ability to actually think through what do I want to get out of this? What do I want to write down? What do I want to talk about? All of that will impact on the benefit and the impact of an MDR. Here, it's different to where I was before. The MDRs are currently run by the suffragan bishops. That was different to where I came from. Every time I had an MDR in the place before was with somebody different, which brought some benefits, but it meant that you didn't build a relationship with the person who you were having an MDR with. We're looking at MDRs, whether they're being run the correct way. Richard has already done some work and some proposals that David and I will follow up with him. Hopefully in the new year, we'll be able to sit down and work through some of the thoughts and just questioning ourselves, is this working well enough? It's not working often enough. We know that. I think at the moment it's every 3 years. I've got a very good PA who just makes sure that we're up to date and puts them in. The way I run them is that, you know, every month I try and do 5 or 6 in a month, but I think David sets aside a longer period of time where he once or twice a year sees people in a more focused period of time. Is that right? Is that working? Is the paperwork right? I'd love your feedback beyond this session as to what's working for you and what's not working for you, because we want this to be something that's of value, both to us and, but far more importantly, to you. Because this is a chance to sit down and to reflect on quite a few of the things that Richard has been talking about. I just wanted to talk about 4 different aspects, and this is kind of based on my experience of being involved in MDRs here, and where I find the most fruitful conversations, where I've thought, I've been sitting there thinking, well, this is just such a privilege to be having these conversations, and they do impact directly on well-being. So the first one is vocational, and it is that question of, are you flourishing in ministry? And to begin to explore that with somebody is just amazing. And it could touch on various things. It could be about the tasks of ministry that you are involved with. Being aware of, there's a whole plethora of things that we do in ministry. What are the things that bring you real joy and real energy? What are the things that are a real struggle? And have you got the right balance? That's a really helpful conversation, because it may well be that admin brings you no joy whatsoever, but you can't not do it because that will lead to other problems. So making sure that you've got enough of the stuff that brings joy, and knowing yourself, what is it that brings me joy in the morning, that when I wake up, I think this is what I was called to ordain ministry for. And if you aren't finding them, why aren't you finding them? And where else can you find them? And so one of the questions we might explore is, if it's not there in your current place, firstly, why not? And can you find it there? But if not, if there are other things, and if there's other skills and gifts that you want to develop beyond your particular context, then we can begin to explore how within the wider diocese might you be able to pick up some of these things and take them further. So that's a really valuable conversation, and it's a really great for your MDR, but to think about, how am I spending the tasks of ministry? What's bringing me joy, and have I got the balance right? And that might be around time, it might be around times of day. I know that I'm much better at doing the things I struggle with in the mornings than I am at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So if I'm kind of timetabling how I spend time during the day, making sure the stuff that I really struggle with, I do when I'm feeling most awake and most alert. That works for me. But the other aspect of conversation that I really enjoy is this, are you still in the correct place for where God is calling you to be? Have you done all that he's asked of you? Are you recognizing that he's calling you somewhere else? And it's fine to feel that. I think, again, it takes great maturity to be able to say, I've done everything I can do in this place. And actually, this parish needs somebody different now. And often that's how God nudges us. We begin to recognize that we've given everything that we can do. There's probably a whole lot of tasks that we could continue on for, but we just sense that they're not ours. And that's a really fruitful time to begin a conversation to say, is God saying it's time to think about somewhere else? It could be that you are in the right place, but it's incredibly challenging. And again, an MDR is a place to explore, why is it challenging? You know that you're called there, but actually it's really hard work. And let's talk about that, and let's acknowledge that. And I would hope that MDRs are a safe place to acknowledge that, because then we can begin to explore what level of support is there out there to be able to do that. Christopher, did you want to ask something on that one? Or is that a cheer? No. I thought you had your hand up. No, are you saying goodbye to somebody? Yeah.
Sorry, Bishop Kelly.
Yeah, you were just waving. Fantastic. Yeah. So hopefully, it's a safe place, because if we can begin to say, yeah, this is where I'm called to be, but it's challenging, Let's be upfront about that. Let's be honest about that. Let's see what we can put around you to try and help you with that. So that's the first aspect of fruitful conversation linked to wellbeing. The second is managing expectations. The hardest challenge is managing your expectations. People have expectations on us, but I think clergy are hardest on themselves. So how do we manage our own expectations in terms of time off, in terms of work ethic, and largely in terms of an overburdened sense of responsibility? I can't possibly take time off because this is how I feel. I'm letting people down if I actually begin to ease up a little bit. And yet we know in our heads that we need that time off in order to be able to thrive ourselves. COVID, what has that done for you on your overburdened sense of responsibility? Has it added to it? Has it given more? How do we manage that? How do we manage our own expectations? There will be expectations from others, but I'm pretty sure that there'll be less than the expectations we put on ourselves. But when they are more than they should be, and when they're unrealistic, again, that's, the MDR is a place to actually explore that and to talk about that. And sometimes hearing, that's an unfair expectation. You mean your church wardens are asking that? That's beyond expectations. Sometimes hearing somebody else say, that isn't right, gives you permission to go back and reassess that. So again, it's a good place to begin to talk about managing expectations. And why can't you do that hobby? Because it means booking out every Wednesday evening, and I can't possibly do that. And I've never been able to do this. So I'm talking to myself. Why is it we feel we cannot commit to a regular weekly event because just in case the PCC needs to meet on that time, or just in case somebody needs to talk to me, I couldn't possibly allow myself to commit to one evening a week for something that brings me joy? And we hear it in our head, but actually activating that can be quite a challenge. So again, MDR is a good place to explore that. Number 3, I love this, sharing the highlights of ministry. One of the first things I say at the beginning of an MDR is I hope you found it really affirming to read what people have said about you. And usually people say, yeah, they're just being nice. I think, no, they're not just being nice. Hear it and receive the affirmation that is out there. And actually having the opportunity to share in the highlights of ministry, to recognise what has been good, to remember the journey. And if it's been 3 years since your last MDR, there's quite a journey to go on, and we probably should be having them more regularly than that. But recognise just what has happened in that time and to rejoice in what is going well. Yes, there'll be a load of stuff that you want to talk about that's challenging and that's difficult, but let's just stop for a moment and highlight and rejoice in what is good. Then my final one, I'm more about specific wellbeing questions. This will be where the element of trust, honesty, being willing to be vulnerable comes about. And if you've had an MDR with me and you've not felt it safe, my apologies for that. But I really hope that David and I are creating a place where you can be honest. I again would hope and trust that the MDR isn't the only place you're having conversations with us. If it is, shout at us, because that shouldn't be the case at all. Because if we've built up that place of knowing one another, that there's a place of trust, a place of honesty, then we can bring in some of those other questions. How is your health? How is your family life? How are your finances? And most importantly, what's your spiritual life like? You'll write on the form what sustains your spiritual life. And there'll be loads of stuff written on that. But how honest can we be in saying, do you know, I'm finding it really, really hard. Yes, I'm doing all of this stuff, but sometimes I feel I'm going through the motions. I know what that's like. I've been there. I'm there time and time again. Can we be honest about that and recognize that? And then say, okay, so what do we need? What do you actually need to put into place to make sure that your spiritual well-being is as good as it could be? Recognizing that there will be times when it's dry, but then thinking through how do we carry ourselves through that? How do we put people around us to help us through those times? And how do we put in the things that will actually help us get back onto track so that we can say, yeah, it is challenging at times, but you know, I never question God's presence with me day by day. And that's where we want to get to, is that day by day, you know that God's love is sustaining you, his peace is surrounding you, and his joy is filling your heart. And yes, it might be a battle to actually sit down and make the time, but that deep sense of God with us is there throughout. So I hope that in an MDR, that is a place where we can begin to look at some of those more challenging wellbeing questions, the more personal, the more ones where it's actually quite hard to be honest. And maybe David and I need to be far more honest with you and say, do you know what? I know what it's like, because actually it's the same for me. And I hope that at that point we're talking one-to-one and recognizing that we're in this together, that we're actually in it together, and we recognize the pains and the challenges that we all carry. I hope that an MDR is more than just a form-filling exercise. I hope it's more than a ticking the box that, yes, we've managed to do that, and my PA can rejoice that we're still up to date and everything's running fine. That is not what this is about. This is a moment and an opportunity that is built on what is already there in terms of our relationship with each other. How do we follow it up? That will depend on me. That will depend largely on you. What are you going to do with what you've spoken about? If you don't think about it till the next time you get the email reminding you that's saying, what did you write on the last one? Then actually you haven't made the most of it yourselves. How will you be able to build on the conversations, the recommendations, the thoughts, the suggestions, and keep thinking through what's going on in my life? How is my well-being, and how can I follow up from what I've heard, what I've actually acknowledged, and what I've said? I think we do need to change some of the paperwork. I think we do need to change through the regularity of how we're having MDRs. As I say, if you've ever got 5 minutes to spare and just want to drop us an email to say, this question would be really helpful, this point in the MDR paperwork is really unhelpful, let us know, because we want to mould it and shape it in a way that's going to work for us all. I think that's enough. Thanks, Mark.
Great, thank you, Bishop Debbie. So we're going to put you into small groups of just 3, one group of 4 people, to give you the opportunity to share what you want to take away from this. I think, is it okay, Bishop Debbie, if we say the question for the group is, how are you going to follow this up, which is where you finished?
Yeah.
What do you need to do in order to learn from this, I think is a good question to take into groups. And I think I won't be in a group, so I'm just going to share some of my vulnerability. I think in my parish job before I came here, we lived in a terrace house with a small garden with lots of people overlooking the garden, lots of neighbours overlooking the garden. And it was only when I admitted to my wife that on my day off, I felt guilty about lying in the sun in the back of the garden on a deck chair. And I just said, I just feel guilty about it because I just think the neighbours are going to see me on a Friday, taking time off. And it was just that admission that helped me. I think it was still about a year or so later that I actually felt as though I could sit in the garden on my day off without feeling guilty. But admitting it was the first step to addressing it. I do hope you can share with one another in groups. So we'll give you until 12:50, and then we'll come back, and it would be great for you to be able to share anything in plenary for a few minutes after that. So we're going to end the live stream now, and